I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine and catch up with our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, who steps back from the daily news to give his sense of the state of the war in 2024. For supporters of Ukraine, it's a difficult listen, but we think an important one.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 10th of January, 1 year and 320 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, and senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant. Dom Nichols and Francis Sternley are away for some training over the next few days. They will be back. I started by asking Joe for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, let's first look at the military aspect of it. And Russia has issued a veiled threat to launch a fresh offensive towards the northeastern part of Ukraine, so around the Kharkiv region, as calls escalate for the creation of a buffer zone to stop attacks on Belgorod. So this started when Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov yesterday said that Russian forces would do everything to prevent Ukrainian bombardment of that frontier region. So you'll remember that Ukraine has essentially targeted Belgorod on a number of occasions, whether it be the city or surrounding region. So the city is only about 20 miles across the border inside Russia, in retaliation for these long-range attacks on Ukrainian cities. So Peskov's comments have essentially prompted demands from pro-Russian ultranationalists for a large-scale offensive to advance at least 15 kilometres, I think that's about 8 or 9 miles, into the Kharkiv region to push back Ukrainian artillery and multi-launch rocket systems out of range of Belgorod. So this is what Peskov had to say. So he said, and I quote, "Of course, our military will continue to do everything to first minimise this danger and then completely get rid of it. The SVO, which is an acronym for Russia's Special Military Operation, so I say that in bunny ears, continues for this purpose." So what I'd say is his sort of veiled threat comes after we reported last week that Ukraine was braced for a renewed offensive near Kharkiv with Russian forces, as well as targeting cities and civilian infrastructure. They were also hitting repeatedly military targets in the northeastern city and the surrounding regions. So there has been significant pressure on the Kremlin to launch a new offensive against Ukraine's second largest city, which Russian forces have never occupied. I believe, from memory, Roland was actually there on the first day of the invasion on February the 24th. And it's basically because of wide-scale discontent over cross-border raids into Belgorod, first by pro-Ukrainian Russian rebels, which was May last year. And then last week, Ukraine's military intelligence published footage purportedly showing an incursion across the front line. So the Institute of the Study of War has been writing on this in their daily battlefield battle update. And it said the ISW, so that's the US-based think tank, has said the Russian military's likely inability to conduct an operation to seize significant territory in Kharkiv in the near term. So they're basically casting doubt on Russia's ability to do so. A Russian incursion 15 kilometres in depth, several hundred kilometres in width, would be a massive operational undertaking that would require a grouping of forces far larger and significantly better resourced than what Russian forces currently have concentrated along the entire international border with Ukraine. But what we should say is it looks like on the Crimea to Liman axis and into sort of Kupiansk, Russia are starting to regroup and better resource their attempt to capture Kupiansk and fight from Crimea, which is Russian held, into Liman. So there is, from the opposite direction, essentially, so you're not quite in the north corner, but if you further skirt down a little south, there are efforts to sort of ramp up and capture land inside the Kharkiv Oblast. But moving away from that, Russia is forcing farmers in the occupied Ukrainian regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia to join its army. That's according to Ukraine's military intelligence. The HUR, so the HUR, accused local authorities in the region of sending letters to farms telling all men of military age to sign up. It claims if they do not, fines of up to 400,000 rubles, that's about £3,500, have been threatened. So the HUR, the military intelligence unit, under the eyes of Major General Budinov, said it believed the mobilization push had been prompted by Russian losses at the front line and the Kremlin's reluctance to call up men in its internationally recognized territories ahead of March's presidential elections. It's basically saying that they are looking to forcibly mobilize men in occupied areas, so Ukrainians to fight Ukrainians, because they are reluctant to mobilize Russians inside the Russian borders ahead of these presidential elections. So interesting, and it's not something that is new. We've heard lots of people who have been actually forced to remain inside occupied territories that have been receiving letters about summons and basically threatened that they will be forcibly conscripted into the Russian forces and told to fight against Ukrainians, or basically killed if they don't. So yeah, it's not new, but it's again interesting context that it's happening around the discussion when Vladimir Putin won't or will not mobilize again for any offensives. Back to more secret peace talks and reports of them. So Bloomberg has reported that Ukraine held secret talks with the G7, Saudi Arabia, India and Turkey about potential conditions for peace with Russia. So apparently there was a summit in Riyadh, which is Saudi Arabia's capital, on December 16th, aimed to counter Russia's attempts to depict Ukraine as unwilling to negotiate an end to the war. So the G7 are reported to have rejected calls from attendees from outside the group to engage directly with Russia on a potential ceasefire. So good news for Ukraine, and what we were discussing yesterday about not wanting, or in previous days about not wanting a ceasefire. So they reportedly insisted that any deal must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that fits in with Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, which basically says that you can't really have any negotiations until Russia withdraws from the recognised 1991 borders, which also includes Crimea, by the way. So then to politics and diplomacy. So Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is on a tour of the Baltic. So he landed in Lithuania, but he's also set to visit Estonia and Latvia. So this is what he said on X, formerly known Twitter, formerly known as whatever we call it. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are reliable friends and principal partners. Security, EU and NATO integration, cooperation on electric warfare and drones, and further coordination of European support are on the agenda. And it's slightly breaking, and I caught Zelensky on Telegram and Twitter talking about it, so I'll quickly just grab it while I can. But he was basically saying that he was in Lithuania to sign a deal for the long-term sort of security of Ukraine, which involved weapons, equipment, training for our soldiers, and Lithuania's leadership in a demining coalition. But basically, what we think is, what has basically been signed today, is that Ukraine and Lithuania are putting together a deal which would mean a ramping up or starting of drone production, possibly on Lithuanian territory, because it's easier to get logistical supplies of kit there, and then they can easily be transported into Ukraine from there. So this will probably all be part of Zelensky's promise, his bid to manufacture 1 million drones, whether they be FPV, these first-person view attack drones, or other kinds of drones to support its long-range capabilities this year. So Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has ordered European officials to draw up a list of each country's planned weapon shipments to Ukraine in a bid to put pressure on allies to fulfill deliveries. So the German Chancellor has warned the European Union and its 27 member states that their military contributions to Kyiv's fight against the Russian invasion are too small. So initially, this move will pile huge pressure on France, Italy and Spain to commit more support for Ukraine as the flow of Western weapons and aid basically wanes. So Europe is under significant pressure from the United States, which has been the largest single country donor to Ukraine, to take over the mantle in supporting Kyiv, while basically Joe Biden's own aid plans are blocked by Republicans in Congress. So despite early opposition for arming Ukraine, Berlin has become Volodymyr Zelensky's second largest international backer behind Washington. So late last year, Germany, which is Europe's largest economy, promised to double its military aid to Ukraine to 8 billion euros for 2024. But Olaf Scholz has warned, and I quote, "This alone will not be enough to guarantee Ukraine's security in the long term. I therefore call on our allies in the European Union to also step up their efforts in support for Ukraine. The arms deliveries for Ukraine planned so far by the majority of EU member states are by all means too small." So frustrated by Europe's waning support for Kyiv, say not just Europe, the US has run out of funds as of the beginning of this year, Mr. Scholz has ordered European officials to draw up a list of promised future weapons deliveries, basically arguing that we need sort of sight of what's going on because we are not aware of them. So the dossier is going to be presented to EU leaders as evidence they aren't pulling their weight when they meet for an emergency Brussels summit on February the 1st, which was basically penciled in to discuss the bloc's planned 50 billion in financial aid for Kyiv. So it's not weapons, but that's financial macroeconomic assistance, which was discussed in the December summit, but blocked by Hungary and Viktor Orban. So why I mentioned this move will likely pile pressure on Paris, Rome and Madrid, who are the EU's second, third and fourth largest economies, but it's because they've been deemed to have basically not been doing enough. So Germany has basically come in, as the US has, I guess, done, increasingly frustrated that their actions, so this is the other European economies, do not match their promises of support for Kyiv for as long as it takes. And essentially, they're annoyed. Berlin's annoyed because Berlin is constantly in the firing line and accused of not doing enough for Ukraine. So diplomatic sources have previously told me and complained that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and I quote, "preference is for big speeches over big support," which is an idea, if accepted by the majority of Europe, is an acceptance that Kyiv and Europe loses this war. The exasperation has led Germany seeking to reduce the amount it gives to a 20 billion euro planned EU fund for purchasing weapons for Ukraine, and that's according to a document leaked to me last month. So this confidential non-paper by Berlin argued that its bilateral donations should be considered against funds it is expected to pay into this cash pot. But without Germany's contribution, which is about a quarter of the entire war chest, there are fears that the European Peace Facility, which has provided Kyiv with around 4.5 billion euros in weaponry and trained more than 30,000 recruits, would simply fall apart. Because of the scheme, France, Italy and Spain's bilateral contributions to Ukraine are seen as incredibly low, because it's basically allowed them to claim back for hardware sent to Kyiv rather than just simply donating that kit and paying for it itself. So Paris has donated only 544 million in aid since the start of the full-scale invasion, and in the weeks before that, according to a tracker maintained by the Kiel Institute, that's a German think tank. Similarly, Rome has promised just 691 million and Madrid 348 million. So let's take that into comparison. Germany has promised a total of 17 billion and Britain has promised 6.5 billion so far. There's obviously doubts over Britain's future aid, but if you speak to Grant Shapps and his team, they do insist it's coming. And I guess Whitehall sources are pointing that the UK would seek to basically rerun its 2.3 billion pound promise that is made to Ukraine each year. So the European Union has already promised to sort of scale up its support for Ukraine. So this is according to Belgium's Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. His comment come basically a day after Belgium took over the EU's 6-month rotating presidency. So this is what Alexander De Croo had to say. The EU will further scale up its support to Ukraine. He added, We will continue bringing our economies and people closer while Ukraine progresses on its accession path. He's talking about Ukraine moving forward as it joins the EU. It was offered candidate status and accession talks at that summit in Brussels in December. And meanwhile, going to the Arctic, and Alexei Navalny, who is the basically only most prominent Russian opposition who is banged up in a Russian gulag, he has joked, or for a spokesperson or spokesman, about the invigorating conditions at the Arctic Circle AK-free penal colony that he was moved to in December. So the jailed Russian opposition leader wrote in an update for his supporters on Telegram and shared a picture of the yard he's allowed to walk in, concrete walled and topped with metal bars, 11 long and 3 steps wide. And this is what Navalny wrote: "It has not been colder than minus 32 degrees Celsius. Nothing quite invigorates you like a walk in Yamal at 6:30 in the morning. Even at this temperature, you can walk for more than half an hour only if you manage to grow a new nose, new ears, and new fingers." So IK-free, is nicknamed the Polar Wolf. It's about 40 miles from the Arctic Circle and was founded in the 1960s as a gulag in the Yamal Nenets region. And I'll stop there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's often quite difficult, I think, to keep track of all the aid promises, the money. So thank you so much for talking us through all of that. Roland, Oliphant, can we come to you? First of all, welcome back and Happy New Year. It's very good to have you back with us. We run this podcast daily. We always start, as Joe has just done, with the news from Ukraine and Russia. And I think sometimes we find it difficult to sort of take a step back, take in and analyse the broader picture. Could you do that for us? What's the tenor of the conversations you've been having with contacts and friends in Ukraine? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I suppose I do have a bit of perspective. I've been off for a couple of months and not deliberately taking a break from news and being a civilian, really. And the past several days I've been speaking to a lot of my contacts, sources, friends, sources who've become friends. And the tenor, the general tenor is basically quite pessimistic at the moment. I think everybody is sounding gloomy for one reason or another, and there's a number of things that feed into that. There's obvious fatigue, which is not surprising we're about to enter the third year of the war, aren't we? That's not surprising. That's been building for a while. But also, people are acutely aware of these discussions in the West, the kind of American aid being held up, European aid being held up. That worries them. I think that the failure of the counteroffensive has begun to hit home. I don't think the failure of the counteroffensive came as a surprise to anyone who was closely following it. Certainly not to the soldiers who were fighting in it. Like journalists I know, Ukrainians I've spoken to, were not, so they're not shocked by it. But I think last time I was there, or last time I spoke to you guys, I think we were still waiting for it finally to peter out before it could be called, the whistle was blown, and you know what the outcome is. And right up to that last moment, there was this hope, well, maybe we'll get the breakthrough. It just didn't happen. And there's no way you can paint that huge battle, which was the big set-piece battle of last year, as anything other than Ukrainian defeat, and quite serious one. A lot of hopes were riding on it, obviously. I think that's hit a lot of people, and this uncertainty about what comes next. And added on top of that, and this comes up in multiple conversations with multiple people, unprompted, is a sense that kind of political life is back to business as usual, and in the kind of worst ways. And that goes hand in hand with a sense that the unity that there was, that incredible sense of national solidarity that there was in the first weeks and months of the war, has dissipated. I was speaking to a soldier I know in the Kharkiv region. He's been fighting, except when he was wounded and recovering, he's basically been on duty since he signed up in a couple of days after, or in fact on the day of the full-scale invasion, nearly 2 years ago now. And he said, just let me actually pull up the quote so I can give it to you. We're suffering from our government. There's not so much respect. There's no money, no vacations if you're in the army, bad healthcare. You need to force it out of the government. And that's as a soldier. As a citizen, it may be even worse, because now we've got citizens mobilized by first. This guy's a volunteer, right? He's a guy who wanted to fight, is still fighting, so he's going to carry on fighting. Saying, you're now finding yourself alongside people who don't really want to be there. They don't want to be there because they don't know what will be with them and their families if they get injured. There's very little trust, he's saying, in the powers that be, in the government, in the Ministry of Defence, to kind of look after you if something goes wrong. From the first days, all Ukrainians were together to defend the country with the government, and now it's like we're separated. We have people with money, with power, who are dealing with their own problems, and we have poor people who need to fight for this government. I can see no justice. Many in the army feel like me. Maybe most in the army feel like me, because we see this corruption and it's stupid. Now, that could just be, one disgruntled guy, but that kind of sentiment has been expressed to me by, multiple people over the past few days, and not just soldiers. Just a deep kind of frustration. There's also this kind of diffidence about talking about corruption, this kind of consciousness that the more kind of Western allies see that discussed openly, there's a fear of it being used as an excuse to close down aid supplies that Ukraine really needs. But at the same time, there's definitely, simply amongst people I speak to from all walks of life, a perception at least that there's a bunch of people getting quite rich off this war. And then the next thing that comes up in conversation, has come up several times, is this question of conscription. So there is this new draft law that's meant to come in. It's meant to lower the conscription age from 27 to 25 and provide the legal basis for drafting about 300,000 more people. There's clear kind of political nervousness about the impact that's going to have, about how popular that will be in the government. A lot of people, especially people who are kind of your classic kind of Ukrainian who very much values their freedom and doesn't like being told what to do by the government, finds that objectionable. On the other hand, they know they need money. And one person said to me, I'm deliberately disguising my sources here, but one Ukrainian said to me, who expressed she expressed this dichotomy to me of, like, on the one hand, people don't like that and don't like being told what to do, but on the other hand, the opinion polls, if they're to be believed, and certainly in my anecdotal conversations with people, say that the country wants to keep fighting, it doesn't want to give up, it doesn't want to surrender, and you've got to make a choice. It's either fight, because losses have been high. That's the reality. Losses have been very high. So either you are going to have to go and fight, because the guys who've been fighting have been there for 2 years and haven't had a break, and they're just desperately saying, just give us a month off, or it's going to be the talks and the end. And to wrap it all together, I think part of the reason for the despondency is that there's been 2 years of war and there's no end in sight, really, because people are genuinely tired. People are genuinely fed up. Everybody's lost friends. Everybody's lost family. The country has taken massive losses, and yet they know that Russian war aims haven't changed. This remains an existential war of survival for Ukraine. The Kremlin's objective is to basically destroy the country. And I think that's true. So a tough situation. I haven't detected I wouldn't say there's in my conversation, a kind of constituency for concessions, but there's definitely a gloominess that just sits on top of everything. It kind of permeates every conversation I've had. So if that's not very optimistic.
Not at all, Roland. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking us through some of your thoughts. Let's keep on looking back before we start looking forward. Do you think there are any stories over the past few months or in the new year that have been underanalyzed or considered by the media and maybe the public as well?
I've been thinking about that. I don't have an easy answer for you on that. Do you want? I apologize. I think that there's this general thing about, I was taken by surprise by how much Gaza distracted everybody, really. And that's not a specific thing about, we've missed this thing about Ukraine or that thing about Ukraine. I feel like news moves quite quickly, and those of us who work in the news are used to it. We're familiar with the bitter reality that something gets old and then something new happens and so on. But the degree to which the Gaza situation knocked Ukraine almost completely off the radar in a way, and just there was barely any time to think about it. I think there's a general sense that it's been put on the back burner, and I think that's understandable, but at the same time somewhat unfortunate, because I still think, tiresome though it is, wearisome though it is, this remains the single greatest kind of security issue, geostrategic issue, everything you want to call, facing certainly Europe at this moment.
Roland, you mentioned in your conversations a sort of general tone of despondency, of gloominess. Could we flip this round? What positives do you see at the moment, maybe in the future? And what do you think are the sort of big challenges? You've touched on some of these points, but maybe it'd be good to wrap them up. What are the big challenges in the year ahead for both Russia and Ukraine?
I mean, Ukraine's, always been the underdog, and it has the biggest challenges, I suppose. I mean, look, it's still in the fight. I think despite the despondency, even that soldier who was telling me how annoyed he is and all his comrades are with a lot of the richer people in the country, if you will, or the more powerful, or the government, he was quite clear. He was like, we're going to fight. There's no question about that. Whatever I'm saying now, that's not over. I think, and even those who very quietly, privately say things like, listen, don't tell anyone, but I would stop fighting now if I could. And I have had those conversations, by the way, and I began to have those conversations, I think, in September, and I've definitely had a couple more of them recently. Even those people don't see how it's meant to stop and are not willing to make to sacrifice Ukrainian nationhood. So, I mean, the country's still together. Western support, I think, is actually still there. I think the clarity that the invasion brought to particularly British, but as Joe was just talking about, the Germans getting frustrated with the French just now, across Europe, this clarity of thought about what the threat is and what's going on here, I don't think that's gone away, actually. There are positives. There was an economic recovery last year, actually. 2022 was dreadful, and then things began to get better. Now, there are these worries about whether the United States and the European Union are going to authorize financial aid for Ukraine in time for that to continue, and there will be trouble if that doesn't happen, but there are signs of a recovering economy. So as long as Ukraine is still standing, that's a kind of positive for them. In terms of the challenges, there's the big challenge of losses and manpower and this conscription law and how they handle that. The failure of the offensive is, I think it's basically a serious setback. And I think back of a cigarette packet kind of thoughts would be that the next task would be to rebuild for potentially another offensive in 2025. So you're talking about at least another year of war. So that's got to be put together. And you have got internal challenges. You've got a public voicing frustrations with the government that they might not have voiced before. And if you talk to people who, and journalists who follow politics, or even people in the system as well, there's definite signs of tensions within the Ukrainian government, between departments, between the presidential administration, different ministries. I'm sure you've talked about on this podcast before, but a lot of people talk about this perceived kind of tensions between General Zaluzhny and Volodymyr Zelensky and how that's affecting morale. I think that is keeping it together in a third year of war is always going to be difficult, and that's a challenge. And you've got, I was speaking to some people in kind of parts of the Ukrainian government apparatus, let's put it that way, who said one thing that's on their mind is the number of people abroad and how they'd quite like to see people coming back for economic reasons as much as anything else. A lot of Ukrainians are abroad, and one of the concerns gnawing at the back of their minds is that the longer this war goes on, that's fewer people who are going to come back, fewer refugees who are going to... The longer it goes on, the longer refugees have had to put down their roots in another country, decide this is where my life is, and not come back, and that's bad news for the country. And then there's the external pressures, right? I mean, these debates about the continuation of aid, these debates about whether the failure of the offensive compels the West to yank the chain, as one Ukrainian diplomat put it to me, and finally say, okay, it's time for you to sit down and have the unpalatable talks about conceding territory to the Russians in exchange for peace. Is that going to happen? I don't know. But this election in America in November, I think everyone's going to be looking at that and readying for that, because the perception will be that an awful lot rides on that. And I think actually Russia's got a lot of the same problems, right? I mean, okay, it's bigger. Okay, the war generally isn't on its territory. It's got all these resources. It can source weapons from North Korea, but it's the third year of a very big war. They've got an election in March. I wouldn't waste any time at all kind of agonizing about what the result of that is going to be. Vladimir, they have had a lot of practice in making sure Vladimir Putin wins whatever absurdly high percentage of the vote and will be in office basically for life. But these things have impacts on society, and people get tired, and the longer it goes on, the longer Russia is storing up all of these debts. I mean, not just in financial terms, but I mean, when you put a country through the strain of a war, you're borrowing against future stability, against future kind of public order, really. So, and there's the recruitment thing as well. We know since the beginning of the war, Vladimir Putin has tried to avoid formal mobilization, announcing another wave of mobilization and conscription and so on, for the same reasons why the Ukrainians are nervous about it. It's not a popular thing to do, right? Most people don't want to, get given a rifle and sent off to maybe come back in a body bag, or even worse, maimed for life. So I think Russia's got it's the same thing, those long-term attritional challenges. And by the West is also undergoing that challenge, which we talked about since the beginning of the war, right, is that it's a test of staying power, it's a test of your commitment. And the Kremlin thinks or believes that the West doesn't have the commitment, doesn't have the will to see this through. That test is still happening, right? And this year is the year the Kremlin's making signals that says it thinks that maybe this is the year that Western resolve does begin to crumble. So everybody on all sides is under pressure and still being tested in every possible way, really.
Roland, just one more question from me, really. You mentioned there the Russian election is fast approaching. For those of our listeners and those of us who haven't followed Russian presidential elections closely in the past, what should we expect? What are the stories we should be looking for? What do you make of it? As you said, it's in March, isn't it?
It's in March. Maybe I'm jaded because I spent so much time in Russia going through the, what do you call it, a charade or something? Going through the motions of caring about an election, and kind of everybody, it was almost Emperor's New Clothes stuff. But maybe that's retrospect speaking. But, I went through so many of these elections where it was like, oh, well, of course, Putin's the favored candidate, but what about this? What about that? Oh, there's this insurgent and so on. In retrospect, everyone was playing the Emperor's New Clothes. So, of course, Vladimir Putin is going to win. He's going to win comfortably. The main real kind of talented oppositionist threat is Alexei Navalny, and he's in prison. There will be a chunk of the usual suspects who do not want to vote for Vladimir Putin or United Russia. I don't know whether they don't vote or they vote communist like they have in the past, just as a kind of protest thing. But they are not enough to shift things. And if past practice is anything to go by, you can expect a kind of nominally independent candidate who will suddenly surge to prominence as the possible alternative, who is saying the things that liberals or oppositionists want to hear, or appears to be speaking truth to power about the government doesn't pay attention to us. And that person, you can be fairly reliably sure, has been picked for the role and is playing the role of a kind of spoiler candidate to absorb opposition votes, to create an image of legitimacy to the election. We had a choice. There was an opposition candidate. The opposition candidate criticized the president. No one stopped them, but he won. That is, that's part of the playbook. On the other hand, I think one reason that Vladimir Putin's managed to stay in power so long is that maybe one day they will get complacent, but I don't think they are complacent about this kind of thing. And you can see them doing the kind of bread and butter electioneering in a way. So yesterday, was it? What's the date today? It's the 10th. Nice. Yesterday. I think it was yesterday. So there's only these headlines in Russian media about how Vladimir Putin has personally taken control of the situation surrounding central heating in Moscow region and Kherson region as well, by the way, the occupied part of Ukraine. Now, this follows a few kind of high-profile outages of central heating. Sorry, for context, for those of you who don't know the former Soviet Union, most cities and towns in Russia and Ukraine, the former Soviet states, have centralized central heating, which means you don't have an individual boiler in your flat. It all comes from a power station that heats the entire district, and you can't really turn on your heating or turn it off. That's the thing, but which is really useful in a cold Russian winter. But if the boiler house goes out, then suddenly you've got whole blocks without heating, and this happened somewhere in Moscow region. Putin hasn't really pulled those stunts for a while, really. And the Kremlinology is that, look, this is a signal that the Kremlin isn't taking anything for granted, that they still feel like they've got to have the president showing that I am taking care of those bread and butter issues that Russians basically care about. Basically more than the big questions about, are we standing up to America? Is Russian honor being defended? Are the so-called Nazis being beaten in Ukraine? Really, underpinning Vladimir Putin's success from the beginning was a very basic bread and butter social contract. So I think the spin doctors in the Kremlin are aware of that, and they're going to try to ensure that people see the big man appearing to look after them. Never say never. I said they don't get complacent. I don't know, sometimes things snap. I was in Moscow in 2011 when patience snapped when Vladimir Putin said he was coming back for a second term after Medvedev, and suddenly you had an explosion of protest in Moscow, which nobody thought was possible at the time. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere. It didn't lead to the fall of the government. But the sudden surge of people saying, no, we've had enough, had come from a community, a society where normally, like the conversations you had were just routinely, our politics has nothing to do with me, it doesn't matter, I can't change anything anyway. It just snapped like that. The situation's different now, but never rule it out. Never assume that you can't be surprised by that place.
Thank you so much for all of that, Roland. Joe, I don't know if you've got any questions, or should we move to our final thoughts?
Hi, Roland. Welcome back after your well-deserved break. I just maybe we could open up a discussion on how you feel and how I feel and David feels the military picture will play out on the front lines in 2024. Because we speak about, and I've spoken to various NATO officials, American, British, German, French, whatever, and they all agree that this war is going on beyond 2024, definitely into 2025. So it'd be interesting to see, what are your views on how the soldiers that we speak to, what are they going to be doing next year when there's probably not sufficient ammunition, sufficient hardware to maintain or sustain another attempt at a huge offensive like they attempted last year?
It's a good question, Joe. The simple answer is don't predict anything. But I think I was talking about that back of a cigarette packet kind of uninformed guess would be in line with what you just said, right? That the resources aren't there. And that, look, the counteroffensive demonstrated that, number one, like the battlefield is pretty much transparent, right? The chances of repeating a surprise like the counteroffensive in Kharkiv in September 22 is slim to nothing, right? So, you know, the battlefield's transparent. It's very difficult to achieve surprise, and the resources required to break those front lines are enormous, and they were not sufficient. There are all kinds of shortcomings, and we've talked about them before. You know, I mean, the squaddies that I spoke to at the time were saying the training was bad. Frankly, I think a lot of the brigades that were put in were too fresh, not adequately trained. I think there was clearly a failure to appreciate somewhere, and I don't know whose fault it is. Was it Ukrainians? Was it NATO advisors? I don't know, but somebody didn't appreciate the level of force and resource required for kind of conventional warfare on that scale, which of course NATO hasn't done since Korea, probably. I don't know, my guess would be stasis, kind of building up to a big push in 2025. And I guess that the Russians would be doing the same. But I don't know. I mean, that's a guess. I think the challenge for the Ukrainians might be to resist pressure to fill out a new brigade with new recruits and go, right, we've got to do something now, and throw that brigade into some kind of offensive after only a couple of months training just because it happens to be a fresh new brigade when it's actually full of quite raw, not ready guys, because that just keeps you in this cycle of then suddenly you've got another undermanned brigade that's got to be fitted out again, and so on.
Joe, I don't know, does that tally with your thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, I'd hate to predict anything without sort of genuine intelligence reports. But yeah, look, I guess 2024 is about conserving your forces and basically force generation. Can you rebuild your forces, replenish them? Because there were significant losses in some areas of the front line so especially in the south, where fighting was brutal. And yes, there are issues with training. It takes, like a NATO soldier, like Hamish is listening as usual. And how long did it take Hamish to learn to properly utilise a Challenger 2 tank in his case? But there's these guys who have probably never been a tanker before, and they've been assigned to a unit of either volunteered or conscripted into the Ukrainian army. So it's incredibly difficult. So what I'm guessing is Ukraine has to preserve its force, maintain the front line, don't allow a Russian breakthrough, so an active defense, but it has to put enough pressure on the Russian lines to keep probing, keep doing things to keep Russia in the same position. It doesn't want to allow Russia to conserve and replenish its forces anymore. But then you've also got this great long range duel that's going on. You've got Russia dumping as much as it can on Ukrainian cities, and then Ukraine is aiming into Crimea. It's looking to continue its degradation of the Black Sea Fleet. It's hitting targets in Belgorod, whether it be ammunition dumps, rocket launchers, other places where drones are launched from. So I see sort of 2024 being the year of the long range attacks. The front line's pretty flat unless something short of a miracle happens. While we look to the West, can it give Ukraine something? Is there going to be a new technology that Zelensky spoke about in his interview with The Economist, new technology that will change this? So I won't call it a stalemate. I don't think that's fair because it's still all to play for. It's not in deadlock. Both sides have it there to fight for. So yeah, but what I don't see is a massive sort of changing of the front lines, and I see probably much more emphasis on these deep fires, deep strikes aimed at trying to break the logistics and basically the efforts to sustain the forces on the front line and any chance of force generation going on. And yeah, I'll stop there on that.
Well, thank you very much, Roland and Joe. Don't worry, Hamish, we'll come to you another day, I think, because I have this room for very much longer, I'm afraid. But let's go then to our final thoughts. This has been quite a sobering podcast, I think, and maybe not depressing. Maybe depressing is wrong, but sort of gloomy, as you said, and as you said, Roland. Roland, can I come to you first, as Joe's just been? How would you sum up the threads of what you've been talking about today?
Look, war is... Sorry, speaking in cliches again. It's never nice, and long wars are horrible. I don't personally see an end to this in the near future. And I think part of the tragedy of it is that, for the reasons I was laying out, there is still no obvious way to settle this. And for Western governments and Western listeners, it is interesting to me how profound, it still fascinates me how profound the shift was in, let's say, British perceptions. Right? So I've had conversations with Ukrainian diplomats who were saying things like, let's go back to, say, I don't know, 2018, 2017, something like that. It was really difficult to get even the Brits to go publicly saying, I don't know, just doing what the Ukrainians felt they needed to get the attention of the West. There was this kind of complacency. And I remember having conversations with kind of people around about Whitehall who would, they dismiss Russia as like, oh, it's only got an economy the size of Italy, I wouldn't worry about that. And that's even after the Skripal poisoning, by the way. The way that has shifted is quite remarkable. I don't know how sustainable the shift is, but I still don't see that going away. I think that there is that fundamental kind of waking up, if you will, this idea that Britain at least, or the West in general, kind of still seriously understands that this is not a charity case. This is about its own essential national interests at stake. I don't actually think that's really under threat, to be honest. There is the question of public, excuse me for being slow, fatigue, right? Ukraine fatigue. We have elections in the West. We have a cost of living crisis, all of that. And I definitely think the Kremlin is looking at that very hopefully. But I don't think that those calculations have changed, which is why I think this war is going to drone on for a rather while, to be absolutely honest with you.
Thank you very much, Roland. Joe Barnes, would you like to finish the episode today?
Yeah, I really do agree with Roland on the fact that it could drag on for a long time and turn into sort of the stasis of the 2014 conflict, which then allows Russia to rebuild and go again if Ukraine isn't given enough. But I just want to look at the British element of it. I wrote the piece yesterday on Germany, calling on the EU to do more, but there is a big UK element to this as well. So the UK, its funding essentially for Ukraine runs out in March, April time. We've committed £2.3 billion every year in military aid to Ukraine, a little bit more on terms of financial and grants and loans to help Kyiv's economy. And there's been little word from the government on this, whether or not we will basically see Britain donate more or less. So people I speak to kind of say that the 2.3 billion could be rolled over. Ben Wallace, as he departed from the job as Defence Secretary, called on Rishi Sunak to at least match that number. So in a parliamentary debate on Monday, Grant Shapps, the current Defence Secretary, said critics of Britain's commitment to Ukraine would not be disappointed by the government's plans. He told the Commons that this is not in any way, shape or form in danger of running out. He's talking about the cash for Ukraine. And yeah, it just leaves me pondering, and it's a question that I'll be asking. I asked a very senior Whitehall person in charge of Ukrainian stuff the other day, why can't Britain do more? Why can't it double its funding to Ukraine? And the answer was, look, I don't think you're going to be disappointed with when Britain does announce what its plans are for 2024 and onwards, or mid-2024 and onwards. But please judge us when we do that. So I think there's still a bit of soul-searching in Britain over what to do with its Ukrainian funding. I don't see it dropping below that 2.3 billion mark. The rhetoric is too strong from the likes of Sunak and Cameron on that. But I think there are questions over whether or not Britain is prepared to go where Germany went and look at doubling its aid and actually trying to maintain its role as a really senior and prominent backer of Ukraine in the West.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.